2, 1. Hello and welcome to the Let Me Ask You This podcast. I am your host, Chris Toboso, and this is a podcast that we debunk misconceptions about mental health therapy one episode at a time. I've got a very special guest today. He is the Director of Technology for Power Design Inc. He's the owner of the Experience Leadership LLC. He has his doctorates in business administration with the emphasis of information system and enterprise resource management. He is also the author of Leadership Distilled, Serving with Purpose, and the host of the podcast Mastermind for the Masses. Allow me to introduce Dr. Josh Nelson. How you doing, man?
Doing great, Chris. I appreciate you having me on today, and thanks for such a kind introduction there, man.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's well deserved. With all that effort, dude, you got to at least acknowledge it.
Yeah, I know that degree's a mouthful, though. You went through the whole thing, so.
Dude, so what is that, like, if you could kind of, if anything, dumb it down, what is that?
Yeah, so basically think of it like major, minor, right? So major is business administration. The minor is basically IT.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and then that's essentially fitting into what your current position is, right?
Correct. Kind of my current position and, my passions around business in general. So
fantastic. All right. So again, the idea behind this podcast is going to be, obviously exploring what you have done, what you've gone through, and then maybe a few psychological aspects that may incorporate into it, right? So
love it.
First thing we're going to start with is what is your business, Experience Leadership LLC?
Yeah, so Experience Leadership LLC is really formed and designed to kind of take experience management to the next level. So in years past, obviously the concept of management was huge. And over time, we realized that management, although necessary to be effective in leadership, wasn't completely encompassing of everything that was needed by employees to feel valued, feel good. So what we wound up doing was basically focusing on this concept of leadership, and that's what you hear more of now. Well, recently, in the last decade or so, experience management has really come to the forefront, and that does a really good job, I feel, of measuring what's going on, which is in some essence of what management generally is, measuring and making sure that what's supposed to happen happens. But when we take it to leadership, and the concept behind experience leadership is, what is the ideal state? How do we drive to get there? How do we inspire others to really want to own that experience that they provide with whoever they interact with?
Awesome. So if you could define what you would view as what leadership is, how would you define leadership?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And, obviously I wrote a book on it, so I should have a great answer. But I think for me, if I was going to narrow it down, there's really one facet of leadership that makes sense to me, and that's really servant leadership, right? Mm-hmm. When you think about leadership, there really is no need for it if there aren't other people that you're serving. Anybody a leader without a team isn't a leader, right? They're just an individual contributor at that point. So if you're not thinking towards the benefit of your team with the actions that you take, I think it would be very difficult to call yourself a leader or that you're practicing leadership.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's interesting because another individual I had on the podcast, he was a good friend of mine, but he was a manager in a bunch of different positions, and one of the biggest things that he essentially emphasized to his success in those positions was putting the employees first.
Yeah. That
his goal was to get them where they needed to be. If they needed something, that he was able to provide it. That there wasn't a sense of the support wasn't there. He always made sure that he emphasized that the support was there. And in turn, they supported him and backed him up when it was needed.
Exactly.
So it definitely, it comes hand in hand with each other. Mm-hmm. And so for your business, are these like classes that you teach?
Yeah, so it's a myriad of things, right? There's definitely training that's available.
Okay.
There is also a certification program that we're working towards. It's not quite there yet. But then, beyond the facilitation, which is more geared at how do we make an impact for a large group of people, we actually have individual coaching and consulting. So whether you're looking at processes and procedures, or you're looking at people, or you're looking for personal and professional growth, we can really help in any of those aspects when it comes to where you want to develop, not only in your general leadership skills, but also in the world of experience management and experience leadership.
Wow, that's awesome. And you guys have a website?
We do. We do. So right now, there's a couple of places you can go. You can go to xpleadership.biz, or you can check out drjoshnelson.com. Either one of those.
Awesome. So definitely check that out. That's some positive information there. So you seem to have enjoyment in helping others grow. Yes. And if anything, like you said, be a leader, right? So you're leading people. Where would you say that passion stemmed from?
Yeah, so I think personally, it's driven by priorities, right? And as long as you have your priorities set and you never make decisions that conflict that, or try not to, wherever you wind up, you're going to be happy with. And so for me personally, my priority is I'm a very religious, like devout Christian, and so for me, it's always been working for I'm working for the Lord rather than for myself or other people, right? And in that way, it's just always prompted me to want to give and serve. So I highlighted on my book, but even if you don't agree with necessarily all the information that's in like the Bible, one of the things that I think is fantastic is it's a very good guidebook for just general instruction on things that can benefit you.
Yeah, well, it's so funny. I was watching a video, and a guy had made a statement where he said, regardless if everything in the Bible is true, or that that the whole aspect of any of it being true, if you actually follow the Bible, it just inherently leads to a better society. Like just following the general rules will inherently have us living in a better society, regardless regardless if it was true or not. So but unfortunately, I've also learned that it's very difficult for people that once there is a certain stigma that's been instilled to this perspective, then it becomes very difficult to turn it around. And it's kind of interesting because one of the goals for this podcast is essentially to change the perspective of how most people view therapy, because therapy is typically like mental health therapy is typically viewed as there's something wrong with you, you have a problem, and people don't want to acknowledge that there might be something going on with them. So the goal would be, it's not looking at it like there's something wrong with you. It's looking at it like, I can always better myself. There's things that you don't even consider because they happen subconsciously. So the best way to try to figure these things out is to talk them through.
Right.
Well, who better than to talk to somebody who is typically trained? Now, I also had somebody on the podcast that brought up a great point that you don't necessarily have to have a therapist for that. You could, if you have a mentor or if you have a confidant that you respect and that is in a position that is willing to offer the wisdom, that tends to be able to help as well. Because at the end of the day, your goal is you want somebody to really listen to what you have to say and give you some constructive feedback to it.
Exactly. And that's what I love about things like this, or the podcast that I host, is it gives us the opportunity to really pick each other's brain, right? And look at it from different perspectives. I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier, and I think the comment, and I might butcher it a little bit, but essentially it was, we all have room to grow and improve. Nobody's perfect. And I think that's really what wisdom boils down to be, right? Is when the more you realize how little you know, it seems like the wiser you become.
Yeah. And I think it humbles a lot of people, because when you don't think you know it all, you or
You listen more.
yeah, I really wish that people would listen just a little bit more, because you gain so much more when you're willing to just take a second and really think about what you're going to say. And I think people would have less problems in their understanding of each other if you chose your words more carefully. I don't know if you know who Dr. Jordan Peterson is.
Oh, I don't think I'm familiar.
He is I would say at the moment, a very well-known clinical psychiatrist from Canada. And he wrote a book called The 12 Rules for Life.
Okay.
And one of the rules was to choose your words carefully. And I definitely think that's a powerful statement, because if you take the time to really choose the right words that you want to say, I think you'll be able to effectively get your meaning across.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the goal, or at least for me, is I would rather my message get across to the person of who I'm talking to, rather than say what I think is correct, or the correct way of saying it, they not understand me. And then typically there's either confusion or anger or some type of negative emotion normally, and then creates a problem between the two people.
Yeah, communication is so important, and you hit on a couple points there, because you have the sender, you have the receiver, and both of them have to be able to understand the message, as it's intended to be delivered, how it's received. And it actually, if I can take it back to the business world for a second, I told you that's a passion of mine. So when I think about one of the concepts that we have in experienced leadership, it kind of takes it. I'm sure you've heard of the open door policy, right? Many a manager and leader over the years have had an open door policy. Well, what we try to promote is an open mind policy, because just because I have an open door and you can come talk to me doesn't mean I'm listening. Doesn't mean I'm open to your thoughts. All it really means is that I grabbed a buzzword that's popular and said, hey, I have an open door policy. But if you aren't receptive to the communication that's occurring, if you don't at least open your mind to the possibilities of what's being discussed, then, is there any value in that? And so that open mind policy is something that we really try to promote with kind of as one of the concepts of experienced leadership.
That's amazing, man, because I have been in many jobs that will, like you said, claim to have the open door policy. Somebody comes in, voices a concern or voices something that could possibly be better, and more often or not, just ignored.
Correct.
Just in one ear, out the other. Thank you so much for letting me know.
Yep.
Call it a day.
And that's a poor experience from the employee side of things, right? And that's just trying to give your listeners a little more insight into the kind of the difference between the experience management and what we're trying to do with experience leadership. Like, that's experience management is that part. I have an open door policy. You can come in and talk to me. But am I actually allowing that to have its intended purpose and create a new level of improvement in our organization? That was my ring, sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries. I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening right now? So then would you say that your business essentially moves people from the manager title to a leadership title then?
I think we support that. Just like, as I'm sure you've shared, or at least, in your world of, mental health and that element, there's a portion of it where obviously you can be given the tools, you can be given the support and the information, but there's a certain amount of work that the individual has to do for it to be effective. I think the same is true when it comes to moving from management to leadership. Leadership is definitely a strength. It's a muscle or a skill that takes additional refinement, additional work, and practice to really make it be part of just, as you do it more often, you make the right choices and you practice it, your subconscious gets a little more rewired so that that's naturally what comes out. At first, it's obviously a lot more conscious effort. What should I do to be a good leader, quote unquote? But as time progresses and you kind of define your style, you are able to naturally portray that leadership. And I think one of the things we do is we offer the ability to kind of act as a catalyst and hopefully expedite that process. But the work is always going to be on the individual.
Right. That's pretty cool. I was just, it's funny, as you were explaining, I was thinking in my head, I was like, if you could get yourself in front of businesses to be like a CRM with moving people from like a standard employee position to like the first level of a managerial position. And then part of that position requires you to do these trainings. There are some businesses that have the leadership structure, like transitioning from a basic level of employment to like a management level of employment. There are businesses that have a good transitioning process, but I would arguably say for the most part, they typically don't. So to get in front of businesses like that that would be awesome.
Yeah, and I think that's driving a lot of that certification program that we're developing.
Okay.
So it's been probably in the works for maybe the last 3 months or so. We're really trying to take the training that we've put together and make it into a really reproducible element in those environments, right?
Let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
What got you into IT?
It's a funny story. I think when I was younger, I kind of let life guide me a little bit rather than me guiding life. I think, I never necessarily was one of those guys that had a super passion for a particular field, or at least I didn't realize I did. I hadn't found it yet. So when I was 18 years old, I graduated high school. Kind of took like a year off. I was working at Blockbuster. Some of your listeners may not even remember what that is, but I was there, and one day I just realized, this isn't leading to the life that I'm going to want to have. So I went and I joined the United States Marine Corps. So I took the ASVAB and went in open contract, and essentially what that means is they pick your job for you. So I went in thinking they're going to make me a grunt, put me on the front lines, and I'll figure out what I want to do along the way. Instead, they said, hey, you scored really well in this computer thing, so we're going to put you in that. So 20 years ago, got trained in technology. And when I got out of the military, my ex-wife was actually 8 months pregnant with our second child, and I realized I needed to continue to provide support for my family. Ironically, my family is really what I discovered to be my passion. And I think that as I worked, I realized that a lot of times in those leadership roles, I kind of felt almost like for lack of a better term, a pseudo father in some of those roles, right? There's some dynamics that correlate.
Very much so,
and so I think that's what I started to realize is, this is what I'm good at. This is what I love to do. This is what I'm passionate about. Because really, once I became a father, it just kind of drove everything that I've done since then. Like I hadn't gone to school. Well, actually I did, and I actually wound up dropping out, I think, at a 0.6 GPA. I thought I was being smart. I put all my classes in one day, and then if you skip that day, it doesn't work out well for you. So with all of that happening, I jumped into the Marine Corps. About a year and a half later, I had my first child, and I said, okay, time to get serious. And so I got my associates before I got out. When I got out, I took the job with the Nielsen Company, did that for a little over a year. And then I went into the school system for, I guess the next 11 years, and kept getting promoted every couple years, had a couple more children, and it seemed like every time I had a child, I got another degree. So that's how I wound up at the doctorate. It's been an interesting journey and path for sure.
Okay, so I have to ask. Did you, when you got your master's,
Yes.
Did you have the intentions of getting your doctorate?
So I'm one of those guys that really likes to shoot for lofty goals and ambitions. So I had always thought maybe one day I'll get my doctorate. I don't know if I necessarily had an intentional plan to get my doctorate, but I was the sole provider for the family. And that with the GI Bill and things like that, and I was able to get the Pell Grant because I had 3 kids and I had a government salary. So it was almost like a second job for me,
Right.
to be honest. So,
Yeah.
what I tried to do was maximize my return on investments. So I would double up on classes, and I think my master's program was scheduled to be 18 months, and I completed it in 10.
Wow.
Because I knew if I did that, then I could continue to advance my education even farther. And somewhere along the line, that would be a benefit, even though it wasn't required for any of the roles I was doing at that time.
Right.
I wanted to set myself up for success, and that's just, I think, partially ingrained in me. I went to the Marines because I felt like it was the hardest. I went to the doctorate because I felt like it was the hardest. I mentioned this on my podcasts, I think, that aired this week. I ran a marathon. I skipped the 5K, the 10K, the half. I just
went straight to the marathon.
Yeah, I didn't do great. So I don't want to give the illusion of that. But I said, well, why build up to it? Why not just go for it?
So you're the kind of guy that when you go and play a video game, if it provides an expert mode, you're ripping expert mode from the get-go.
That's where I start.
That is absolutely hilarious. I love it. So is that something that you have done your whole life?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think it probably goes to some sort of mental element of kind of wanting to, prove myself in some capacity, I'm sure.
Was there anybody else in your family or when you were growing up that was like an extreme go-getter that you can remember or recall?
I mean, I definitely had some good examples of good work ethic. My mom was an incredibly hard worker, and it's interesting. I had some inspiring people. I don't know if you would classify them in your typical like go-getter, right? So I had my one uncle was a missionary in Africa and Uganda for about 30 years. Still pops back and forth over there. Like I said, my mom was a hard worker. My dad was a homicide detective, although when I around 3 or 4, he actually wound up getting PTSD from the force. So he spent, the rest of his life retired, essentially. My brother went into the Air Force. My uncle and aunt were actually both rocket scientists for NASA.
Whoa.
Yeah. And, different things like that. Another aunt and uncle, they owned a dairy farm. So I saw work ethic definitely involved. Yeah. And, I think that helped.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I also had a lot of dreamers. And I think that played a fact. I had a guy, Uncle Jack. I'm not even sure he was really my uncle, but he was involved enough. Yeah. And, he was the type of guy that just loved adventure. He went off and, worked the diamond mines in Arkansas for 6 months and didn't make much, but he made enough to, pay for the hotel while he was there and all of that stuff. So, chasing the dream and aiming big has, I guess, really been an influence in my life throughout.
What a family.
Yeah.
What a family.
True story.
I love it. That's when you just factor in your surroundings, because we can acknowledge that our surroundings play a important contributor to the way we view and handle things. Mm-hmm. So when you are surrounded by people who, maybe it's not the term go-getter, but I would say what they all had was passion for what they wanted to do.
Correct. Yeah.
So you, from day one that you can remember, you have seen people follow their passion. So when you had a passion, you just went gun-ho.
Not only passion, but I think determination, right? Because, and I guess maybe that's an element of that, but when they saw something they wanted to go, they went for it, and they just continued to work at it. Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges we see a lot nowadays is people want that instant gratification because we become so accustomed to it. If I want to, in the past, if you guys couldn't remember the name of a movie, you were just pretty much out of luck. You're not going to know the name of the movie.
You're going to sit there for hours
exactly.
just banging your head because you want to remember, and then you'll randomly remember when you're not thinking about it.
Exactly. And right now, you can just pull out your mini computer in your pocket, right, and look it up in instant.
I think that also contributes to the lack of respect to not necessarily per se older individuals, but typically we used to have a mindset that if somebody older than us, they're normally wiser than us because they've experienced more than us, so they would have good insight. Now I feel like that has disappeared because any insight that's provided, may it be right or wrong, they can look it up on their phone and be like, look, you're wrong.
Yep.
and and I think that also creates a lot of distrust amongst everybody. I mean, I find it makes sense, but I find it interesting that one of the things I learned while going to school was essentially you don't have an opinion, or let me rephrase that. You can have an opinion, but it's not creditable unless there's a study to back it up. If you don't have a study to essentially defend your perspective, then you just have a general opinion. And it makes sense to a certain degree, but I think studies have its own limitations, like anything else. But it definitely has changed the way I view a lot of my perspectives. I won't lie to that, just because it does make sense that if you want to have a perspective on something and it's been studied, you can at least have something to work from to generate a perspective. Yeah. And it gives you a rough idea with the understanding that not everything's 100%.
Right. That's a conversation I have with my oldest, my daughter, quite frequently, right? She's new into college, 18, exploring life, and she's got a lot of great...
I'm sorry. 1 second. How old are you, sir?
39.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Sir, you look great for your age.
Thanks.
By the way.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So she's 18, exploring life with all of the new freedom and such. And, this was even when she was, in 16, 17. But her and I have a lot of differing opinions, and I've always told her that's completely fine as long as you have a reason for why you believe that, right? What I never wanted was a mainstream repetitive, hey, this is what I heard, so it's what I believe now. And I would question her quite a bit on that initially, and we had a few debates, to put it nicely, but ultimately I think that lesson was finally learned, because now if she raises an opinion, again, whether I agree or not is really a moot point, but does she have a valid reason to have that belief? There's got to be a why that you believe that. It can't just be because I heard it from a friend, so.
Absolutely. And I even wanted to go a step farther, where I was working on even putting together a video for content of just explaining that when people even look at a study or want to use a study as a reference, that it really would be in their benefit to make sure that they look at the substance of the study. That it's not something, because what I will acknowledge is you can about nearly find a study to defend anything.
Facts.
But the problem is what it contains. So if you have two studies that did the exact same study, but one of them is a sample group of 100 people over a year, and then the other one is 10,000 people over 5 years, which one's going to obviously be more credible? So, but unfortunately, we don't necessarily look at that. We're like, oh, this study says this. And then it's used more as a, hey, I got you, rather than a good faith debate on trying to get the other person to understand your perspective. That's kind of why, so like before when I said it all depends on what your goal is, because like when I tell somebody, my goal is always for them to understand what I'm trying to say. So I will change my words if it'll help them understand what I'm trying to say. I can't tell you how many people I've met that they would have a great message, but because they say it wrong, or they say it in a way that they think is correct, and then you try to let them know, hey, like, I know what you're trying to say, but if you word it differently, it might come off it might be received more,
Right.
they typically won't care. Or well, not typically, but the people that I know it that have behaved like that don't normally care. They view the scenario more of, I'm going to let you know because I want to be honest with you. And their approach isn't always necessarily the best approach. I do think, especially when it comes to leadership, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to really anything, if you're not willing to adjust how you say something, what's the point of saying it? You just want to tell them just to tell them? Or do you actually want them to understand what you're saying? Because if you do, then why aren't you willing to adjust what you say in order to do that?
That goes back to, one of the original questions you asked me, what is leadership? And it's the intent behind it. So is your intent, to prove your point, be right, make yourself feel better? Or is your intent to really solve some kind of problem, hear out the other person, come to an understanding, and I think that speaks to what you were just talking about. Is my intent to have you understand my point of view, even if you disagree, but at least you can understand? Or is my intent just to make me feel like I won the debate, right? And personally, I think the self-satisfaction doesn't last long.
No, not at all.
But
well, it's one of those things where people, when they speak out of anger, it feels good for that moment, but then after you sit on it, you're like, damn, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
Right. And you're right. It satisfies for that moment, but what is the long term, repercussions?
That's why the practice is so important, because it does inform your subconscious, so that when those emotions come out, when really that's what's driving your actions and behaviors, you've basically, I guess, for lack of a better term, trained it to act in the way that you would hope that it would.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is where this is why I focus so much on trying to push out on because there's such a negative narrative around psychology and the field itself. I want people to know and to just understand that the basic forms of psychology, most people already know.
Right.
It's just giving a name to it. So with your current position,
Yes.
which, by the way, did you work your way up power design, or did you get hired into the position?
A little bit of both. So I got hired in as the IT support manager. So as I had said, I worked in the school system for 11 years. One of the employees there had left for the company that I work at now, and and day one he called me and said, "Hey, this is a really cool company, a really great place to be, but we need some help getting things where they should be or could be." And so he kind of recruited me over there, and about 6 months after he left, I joined him over there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I came in as the IT support manager. A couple of years later, had some pretty good success, and that's when they made me the director of technology experience.
Wow, that's awesome. So since you've been there, how long have you been there?
About 4.5 years.
4.5 years. What has been the biggest challenge?
Wow. I mean, I think the biggest challenge was honestly, I guess, really kind of reshaping the narrative around what IT support was. When I got there, it was in a pretty bad spot. I don't think that's a secret to anyone. And just this last year, we actually won Service Desk of the Year in London. So I flew over there and accepted this award, and it was really, really an amazing accomplishment that the team was able to achieve in just 4 years, right? Because 4 years ago, it was not in a good spot. So I think really reshaping that viewpoint in such a short period of time for the organization. Now I think we are thought of as kind of a strategic business partner that adds value, whereas before I don't believe that was the case. So I think the biggest challenge was changing that mindset.
Got you. And so with changing that mindset, now how big's your team?
The entire team now, as of a few weeks ago, is about 25 individuals.
25.
Yes.
Okay. So with 25, that's still a decent size to get morale to change, right? Because when you're dealing, the bigger the group, it is much harder
Correct.
to have that influence and to be able to get that movement, right? So what would you say that you had the most, or what would you say was the biggest in difficulty to get them to start moving that way?
Yeah, so it's twofold, right? One is heavily driven by relationships when you're looking at it from an external aspect, because it was not only inspiring and getting the folks internally to want to provide that value, but then that needed to be perceived by the company. And so building those relationships interdepartmentally was key. And taking the time to sit down with them, hear their needs, and then actually doing something about it and taking action. Even if that action was saying, hey, I can't do anything for you right now, at least they knew that they were heard and that something had been done. And that built trust. That trust, that trust there at least allowed them to get into that open mind area, right? Oh, they're trying, something's happening. And then they started to see the results. Internally on the team itself, a lot of it was obviously you want to have that shared vision and that, but I think the key was really creating an emotional connection between what we did and what they were doing every day. Because there's a study, and forgive me for not knowing exactly what it is, but there's highly satisfied customers or employees are at a certain level. But if you can get them to that emotional connected portion, they're 52% more loyal. So your customers will obviously stick in longer, but when you think about it from the employee side, 52% increase in loyalty, they're going to work harder. They're going to want to do more. They're going to want to produce more. They're going to have more pride in what they do. So what we were able to do really well was create imagery. And I've done this a few times. I think I picked it up from my Marine Corps days. So when I was in the Marine Corps, 2nd Tank Battalion, they call themselves the masters of the Iron Horse. And so you have kind of, because it's tanks, right? And so there's this image in your head of riding into battle almost like a knight. You're on this iron-clad horse. And so, you just kind of feel empowered, and you can see that. When I was in the school system as a leader, I basically redefined our group as the wolf pack. Effective alone, unstoppable as a team. And, that really drove inspiration there and what we could do. So I carried that forward here, and we actually call ourselves Atlas. It's an acronym for all things logistics and support. But ideally, what it is the old Greek god holding up the earth. Well, we hold up the company. And that emotional inspiration really drove the internal efforts, combined with the external relationship building really allowed for, because we were building the bridge from both sides, and then we were able to create that impact.
It's amazing the efforts that you're willing to put in, and combined with, I'm sure you're evaluating how they're receiving it and making adjustments as needed.
Yes.
And I think it is incredibly crucial for management and leadership to start implementing views like this, because if we continue the route of empty mindset of just we follow this and this is what we do and that's it, nobody's going to have interest in working at these facilities. And I think we're going to eventually see it because of the growth that we're seeing in at-home jobs.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because obviously in the IT realm, remote work is grown massively, and it can be done. What we've seen with my team are the guys that even have the opportunity to work remote want to come into the office.
That's awesome.
Because they want to be in that collaborative environment with their, for lack of a better term, pals, right? I mean, I don't think everyone's hanging out outside of work or anything like that, but they enjoy being in the office. Not to say that remote work doesn't still occur.
Right.
We have a policy for remote Fridays, but that's where I see, Friday they don't have to come in, and if they're anywhere in the near vicinity, they're probably driving in. There's a couple guys that live an hour away, and I get why they might not drive in. Right. Adding 2 hours to your Friday is
a lot.
Is a balance.
Yeah.
So I understand why they wouldn't, but anyone that still has the option and they're 20 minutes down the road, they're probably still driving in, which I think speaks a lot to just the relationships that they've formed with each other, the ownership that they have. and their commitment to really providing excellent service.
Yeah, well, also you guys have a golf simulator, so
We do.
It's hard to say no to that.
The campus is a very beautiful campus, and that does help. But I like to think it's a little more than that.
Oh, for sure. Because again, you can have everything you want, but if you have bad leadership, nobody's gonna want to be there.
Right.
So no one's gonna use it. No, like it's not gonna be a sole drive to bring people, but again, I can imagine that it helps, but just I've talked to a few different business owners, and one of the things that I see, at least when they have a successful setup, is just the care of the employees, that they actually want to put them first, put their concerns and their perspectives into consideration when making decisions. And it's not just about the business. It's not just about money. And I mean, there's plenty of businesses that really show the evidence behind being successful through that. So, I mean, unfortunately, then you have mass corporate locations that behave differently. But at the end of the day, you have a choice of where you'd like to work.
Correct. And, I think the biggest thing to understand is people are the only thing that a business can invest in that gains in value. You buy a building, you buy a piece of software, you buy technology, you buy vehicles, whatever you purchase, it depreciates
Right away.
People only get better.
That is a great way to look at that. God, I love that. Okay, so real quick, I want to go into some things on therapy. So I am curious on your perspective on therapy. So what is your... Have you ever been to therapy?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, okay. So you don't have to tell us, what was going on, but what has been your experience with therapy?
So I think it's like anything, right? You need to kind of, even your general practitioner, because I think earlier we talked about, kind of the bad image that certain things can portray, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you get burned once or possibly even twice, you're like, oh, that's not for me. But I think I've seen that, right? I've tried therapy sometimes, and the therapist was not the right person for me. And then I've had great sessions, right? With great therapists. So I think you need to find the right person for you. Is one important element. Don't be discouraged on the first bad try, right? Be willing to try it again. I think the stigma, I think it's starting to go away, which is good. But one of my favorite commercials that I think probably for me, I was like, yes, that's it, right? There's a guy in the gym and he is trying to bench, 300 pounds or something. And he can't get it up. He's got it on his chest, and his buddy comes over and he's like, hey man, I can help you with that. And he's like, no, man, I don't want any help. And he's like, come on, I'll get it off you. And he's like, you don't know my family. Right. and so he stays trapped under this enormous weight rather than letting somebody help him.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the other things that I've really tried to also help people understand when you think about this concept is you're not only letting someone help you, you're also helping them. When you don't allow someone to help you in your time of need, I think you're doing a disservice, because just flip the roles for a second. If you had a friend or a family member that was in trouble and they wouldn't let you help them, how would you feel? You'd probably be pretty frustrated at that. And you'd be like, why don't you just let me help you? Well, now, flip it again. You're the person not allowing the help. So you're causing all this frustration, anxiety, and angst for people around you, when what you're trying to do is avoid causing that for them, because a lot of times that's what's driving you for not getting help. So you're basically doing the exact thing that you didn't want to do by refusing help.
You are absolutely right. And God, that's so funny. There was a video that I saw that kind of pertained to this. It was a girl talking about how she didn't like how her body looked. And oh no, I'm sorry. It wasn't the way her body looked. She had acne.
Okay.
She had bad acne. So, and then her boyfriend asked her, he said, when you look at other girls in public and they have bad acne, do you think, oh, they're ugly, or oh, that they have problems? And she's like, well, I feel bad for them, but I won't say anything because that's mean. I'm not trying to be mean. And he's like, if you constantly judge people, you're going to always reflect that on yourself as well. So so he recommended for her to take on a practice that every time you look at somebody that you wanted to judge them, you immediately after say 3 positive things about them and watch. And she then claimed that after a few months of doing that, she started looking at herself in a more positive way.
I like that approach. I've never thought of that, but that would be interesting.
It was a very good way of just trying to acknowledge that what we push out, we typically reflect on ourselves. It's the same thing how if someone doesn't understand you, instead of, hey, what do you mean by that? And ask a question. They don't want to feel dumb, so they're going to make you feel dumb instead. They're going to try to turn it around and make it look like you're the problem. But it really typically reflects on them. It's the same thing, with anger. Typically when someone takes out anger on you, it's because they're angry at themselves or they're angry at something that's going on. And the more we can learn to kind of reflect and at least notice it. I mean, the first step is to at least notice when these things happen. And you can kind of try to approach different ways of doing something about it. Because I could tell you, I'm a huge advocate of everything to try to do outside of medication if all possible. There are things that you can implement into your life that even if you have a disadvantage, that you could help to compensate for it. It's just a matter of figuring it out, right? So my last guest has ADHD or ADD, I'm sorry. He said he has he has a journal and 2 project managing softwares to help him maintain things that he needs to do. Yes, he needed extra things to be able to maintain it, but he figured it out, right? Sometimes it requires for us to be able to do a few extra steps to be able to get where we need to be, but it's not that it's not possible. Now, people would argue saying that that's not fair, but unfortunately, life has never been fair, and in order for life to be fair, it has to not be fair.
Right. Yeah, you can't have one without
the other. You cannot have one without the other.
And I'll be perfectly honest. If given the choice between 2 people, right, it sounds like I would probably take your last podcast guest because I know that they're determined, they're innovative, they're going to figure out a way to be efficient and get their stuff done. Like that, even though some might look at it as like, oh, he has to have these extra things, what I see is somebody who's self-aware enough to know that, hey, here's a shortcoming and I can fix that and improve. And every day I'm going to pick that person.
It's powerful. Everybody has things wrong with them.
Correct.
But when you're willing to put in the effort to do something about it, makes the difference.
Yes.
Makes the difference. It really I can't really emphasize anymore other than that. It makes a difference. So I wanted to kind of touch base real quick on you said that when it came to your experience with therapy, that it all depends on the therapist. And I wanted to say thank you for saying that, because that has been one of the things that I see very common, that most people have a bad experience and then they're just done. Right. And I used to work at a chiropractic office, and it's the same thing. I think in majority of fields, when you have to go to a specialist, any field, you're going to have your good employees, your bad employees. You're going to have good people, bad people. It is very important to do your research on the person that's going to be affecting your life in such a drastic way. So you're not just going to go like you said, a primary doctor. You're not going to just go see any doctor. You're going to look to see, hey, does this guy, does this person do a good job? Do they have experience? Do they have reviews? You're going to do your research, and that would fall under that same category. And what's also important to this is people practice differently, and they provide it in their descriptions. Mm-hmm. I don't know if people, anytime you ever look online to look for a therapist, they provide a description of what they specialize in. So that would be the crucial thing to focus on depending on what you want. If you don't know and you just want to go to evaluate yourself, just realistically go to any therapist that has well reviews and have a conversation. Because so in chiropractic care, one of the things that I learned was pain is the last symptom to show up for an injury. So you can have an injury that's years old and it not hurt you. And as you get older and over time, things around it don't work properly, and then you start to develop pain. So with therapy, it's kind of the same thing. Over time, you can have a traumatic experience that happened to you at a young age, and most people tend to take traumatic experiences and push them to the back and just forget about it. It didn't happen, doesn't exist. But what happens is eventually you're going to have flare-ups. Mm-hmm. You're going to have things that trigger that emotion, and it'll make you react in a way that you probably didn't want to, and you wouldn't necessarily know why, because that's where it normally processes in your subconscious, right? So when you go to talk to somebody, the idea is you get to explore things that you never took the time to really think about as you grew up.
Yeah.
Because we don't typically reevaluate our lives. When we were younger, we think we have a normal childhood, got our parents, our experiences, and then you become an adult, and then it's all based on your decisions as an adult. Yes, a lot of responsibility falls under your decisions as an adult, absolutely. But when you're a child, you are influenced incredibly.
Yes.
So could it benefit you from learning and understanding where those influences came from and how it affected your life? Mm-hmm. And then you can evaluate whether it affected your life in a good way or a bad way. And if it's a bad way, it gives you an opportunity to do something about it.
Yeah.
But most people don't look at it that way.
Right. And, you said something at the beginning of that about kind of the interaction with the therapist. And it took me back to earlier in our conversation about the validity of a study. Mm-hmm. And you made a great analogy. You said, who are you going to trust? The study that did one person for a year? I think you might have said 10 earlier, but in this example, I'm thinking, the one person with one appointment, that one time you interacted with a therapist, or is it over time? You tried out a few different therapists, you gave it, a few tries, and, you're going to have a different perspective.
Absolutely.
And, hopefully you're lucky and you find the great therapist first go around and it's nothing but a positive experience, because that's also going to influence you and you're going to be a fan of therapy. Mm-hmm. But if the opposite happens, you got to at least be open to trying it again, because if you went into a doctor and they gave you medicine that didn't help for a cold, you're probably not going to give up and live with the cold. You're eventually you're gonna try something else, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was explaining. I said this to one of my friends, and he was like, he didn't know this, and he works at a practice, but a practice is called a practice because they're practicing, mm-hmm. Yep. Right? So it's not 100%. That and even if you go to therapy, just because you go one time doesn't mean it's going to fix the problem. They may give you something to work on, and maybe it'll open the door to something else, right, that needs to be worked on, right? So it's understanding that if you can acknowledge that you can always better yourself and work on yourself, then knowing that you can go to different avenues to take care of yourself, especially your mind. Mm-hmm. You would think the one thing that takes care of us more than anything else is our brain, and we would want to take care of it to the best of our abilities.
Yeah.
So So I got one more question for you, man, before we go ahead and drop it. So with all of your experiences that you've had,
Yes.
at 39 years old, if you can go back to 18, what would you provide as advice to yourself as an 18-year-old coming out of high school?
I think about that question sometimes, and sometimes I almost wouldn't want to go back and give myself advice, because assuming I did that, if I take the Back to Future route instead of like the Avengers route, right? I'm going to influence my life. And to be quite honest, I'm happy with where I wound up. I had struggles, I had trials, I had things I had to learn. But I think there's power that comes from that, if I were to go back and give myself advice, would it send me down a different path and me be a different person today? I know that's not really answering your question, but I guess I guess if I give my kids tons of advice. So if I were to pull from something I tell them, it'd be along those lines, is just have a reason for why you're doing what you're doing, and really guide your own life. Don't let life guide you. I think we see all too often people kind of drift with whatever comes their way and accept things that maybe they aren't happy with, because it's easier to go with the flow and just be in that comfortable zone. And I would say just be okay with moving towards what you want to be. It might not be overnight, that instant gratification piece. It might take you 20 years, but always be consciously making decisions to move you in the direction you want to go, rather than just kind of floating.
God, so true. Awesome. Well, Josh, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah,
this was after rescheduling because of multiple situations.
We made it happen.
We made this happen. I thank you so much for this. This was great content. I really hope that people got to hear your story and really reflect on, if they're in any sort of similar position, like they can really utilize some of these aspects, especially as some type of leadership or management position. And I really hope that we start having people focus more on how we can communicate in ways that we can understand each other better. Yeah. So, but yeah, thank you so much, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. I think it's awesome what you're doing, and wish you the best of luck.
Awesome, man. Thank you. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you guys next time.